Is that how you say it? Is that how you pronounce it? Aether?
Yeah, that's how I've been pronouncing it. I don't know if it's correct, but I think that's how I've been doing it.
Well, we'll have to ask Aether, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's been super cool to follow. And then obviously before that was just aware of you from mostly what you had done with Hire in the first place. And I actually
Hmm.
don't really know the origin story of Hire,
Hmm.
despite being like, pretty involved in recent
Yeah.
months. Like I really it wasn't really on my radar other than maybe just occasionally seeing something about it for probably the first few months of its existence.
Yeah.
And I kind of just thought it was like a token that was like, like any other meme coin, just like, okay, higher, like I get it. Like, I thought it was
Yeah.
like a price go up thing. And then even with just that, I was like, okay, it's like pretty fundamental. Like it's literally just higher and like a green up arrow. Like that's a pretty good idea. But it took me like probably a few more months of just like seeing it here and there to realize like, okay, there's actually a lot more to this. Like there's a real community here that's like got certain values in common and this aesthetic and stuff like that. So I definitely want to like sort of discuss the origin story a little bit of hire more broadly, and then we'll talk about Aether. But before we get into either of those things, maybe if you're willing to just share a bit of your personal story from really before any of this, as early as you're willing to start. I always love to hear like sort of where people come from, and I think it gives good context for the rest of the conversation.
For sure. Yeah, and it's funny what you say about the price stuff, because I almost feel like the price stuff for hire is like a Trojan horse for like all the deeper like headless brand stuff and the community and everything behind it. Like even for me, that's how it worked. It's like, oh, I thought it was price go up and then it turned into this amazing thing. But yeah, I can share a bit about my background. Graduated college in 2020, was working as a product manager in big tech, and pretty quickly did not really enjoy it and realized maybe this wasn't the right thing for me. And right around that time in 2021, I got really into NBA Top Shot, as did a lot of other people. And so that was kind of the what clicked for me with crypto. Before that, I had like a Coinbase account and stuff, but wasn't really doing much with it.
Right.
But when I discovered NBA Top Shot, coming from like a sports fan, like collectibles, like it made sense for me. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, these things will just be digital, and the best way for them to be digital is through this blockchain concept. Even though NBA Top Shot is, very much on a different blockchain with Flow than Ethereum, but that was kind of like how I got into it. Got really into NFTs, got really into art blocks. Specifically, I thought that was really amazing. So I was kind of minting almost every time. Was doing kind of the PFP, like minting, trading, like all that stuff, which was a really fun time and kind of like my time in the trenches in crypto. And I went and worked at NBA Top Shot as a product manager, which was also a really fun time. Like just working on those pack drops that had like 100,000 people in line to buy stuff, trying to manage that excitement, trying to, build a more sustainable product was really fun. And after some time left that to kind of explore more like what I felt like was the frontier of crypto and where more interesting things were happening, which was just on Ethereum in general. And that was right around, I mean, that was around the 1 year anniversary of Nouns, and when it was, I think, still like had good momentum compared to like everything else that was tanking. And so got really excited about Nouns and contributed in that environment a lot. And that taught me a lot about just headless brands, crypto community building, like DAOs. It was really cool to just observe in some ways, and then also just be a contributor. So did some development stuff, did some community stuff, ran like a grants program called Explore Grants, where we funded people like Tigress, who just released these like nouns keychain, Drew Kaufman and Greg, who's now at ENS, like people like that to explore the nouns ecosystem, which was really fun. And I really liked working on that. And then did some dev stuff after that, working on a Nouns Block Explorer, Nouns like accountability tracker for after proposals, pass. And yeah, that kind of led me to right up to, February, March of this year, which is when Hire kind of came up. And I was working on a few other different projects at that time, trying to figure out what to do next. But Hire kind of came in and stole the show when we launched it.
Nice. Yeah, I definitely want to, dig into higher. But before we do, couple questions on prior experience. It's interesting to hear that that Top Shot was kind of like the thing that really sort of like got you into crypto. Like you had a Coinbase and presumably like we're holding maybe a bit of Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever,
Mm.
but like doesn't really sound like you were like super into it. And then Top Shot kind of brought you in and more largely got into other NFTs and things like that. So I'm curious, like a couple things. One is, you know, how you went from discovering Top Shot and being like, okay, this is super cool to like actually working with the company, and
Hmm.
then how that experience compared to sort of, it sounds like the second project, or at least kind of the second one you felt was worth naming in like nouns in terms of something that really captured your interest. And that seemed to be more like working in more of like a decentralized capacity. Like it doesn't sound like you sort of like went and like got a job there necessarily, but you probably were contributing in
Hmm.
somewhat of a similar capacity to like your job at Top Shot. So like it feels like becoming more of sort of crypto native experiences between those two things, if that makes sense. I'm just curious how you might like sort of relate the two.
For sure. Yeah, I think with both of them, the kind of connecting theme is like some sense of agency and just like being able to just do stuff. Every job that I've gotten, I've never applied to a job like directly
Through
without
the
a
front door.
referral, yeah, and gotten it, except for when I my internship at Google. And that was, I don't even know how I got that internship in the first place, which led to my full-time thing, but even that I had like a referral from a friend. So it's like I never really just like, went through the front door. And so with Top Shot, I was using the product a lot. I was kind of hacking around their API, trying to see if I could like, do some arbitrage or something. I had some ideas for the product. And so I just emailed Arthur, who was the head of product, I think is now head of product for most of Dapper Labs, I believe. And I was like, hey, I want to leave my job at Google and come work for you guys. Like, here's like a tech idea I have. Like, I kind of did some stuff with the API. Like, you should probably not make this public. I have like a design idea, and here's like a business idea or something, kind of showing all the sides of product management. And that kind of led me into the interview process, and then did the whole interview thing. And at that time, they were looking to grow and get more PMs. And I mean, I was super junior. I didn't have even a year of experience, but that was really cool. I think, and it's like, yeah, you just gotta kind of create your own luck and just, put something out there and see what works. And that consistently has worked for me. Whereas applying to jobs directly has basically like a, you know, 0% hit rate for me. And then
Yeah.
with nouns, well, that's what I liked about nouns is that in nouns you had to, I mean, there's holders, so you could, come in and buy a noun and you had a little bit of social credibility immediately. But otherwise, like, you kind of had just to come in and create your own luck and put up a proposal and like talk to people. And I found that really appealing. Like there's definitely like, in any almost political environment, there's going to be like politics, but I thought it was pretty merit based, and I really liked that. And so yeah, working on the grants program, I was just like, hey, I have this idea for a grants program. Like we would give this much to 5 different people, and it was a pretty big amount. Like it was not trivial, but I felt like, hey, to attract top talent, which I think we did, you need a bigger amount. Like a smaller amount is not going to work for someone who's a software developer in San Francisco. You can't give them, $1,000 a month and think that's going to go far. So yeah, I had like this idea for it and just thought, let's do it, and built a little team. It was me and Jihad and Dot, who was one of the founders of Little Nouns. And yeah, that was a lot of fun. So I think with both of those, and what I liked about Nouns is, and all the projects that I did after that in Nouns, it was just come up with an idea, like put it out there. And I think that's very much the decentralized ethos that, I like about Hire too. With Hire, there's not even really a DAO or proposals or voting, so there's not really much politics because we don't really give grants. I mean, there's the Hire party, but it's not super active for that kind of exact reason. Is that it's not really fun to do proposals, but at the end of the day, that's what I like about these like permissionless systems is you can just like build on top of stuff without really having to ask. And then if people like it, they can, you know, engage with you more on it or pay you, or, you can go from there.
Yeah, I resonate with what you said around not applying or not having much success applying the things through
Yeah.
the front door. I started my career in investment banking and was
Mhm.
looking for an out after about a year, and but I didn't want to just like leave. I wanted to find something that I wanted in on more so than just like satisfying the desire to get out, which I saw a lot
Yeah.
of friends doing. And so I was applying to like, jobs that were pretty competitive and stuff. And I can't even tell you how many I applied to over the course of like a year, and all like sort of just like through the front door. They have like pretty rigid processes, and
Yeah.
basically just like none of them worked out. So eventually at some point I was like, I need to, after my second year, the timing was just kind of right in a number of ways. And I just left without knowing what was next. And my next, job came through, actually like my main podcast, Pod of Jake, one of my first 30 something odd guests was, a great guy who, I was thought was one of the smartest guys in the world, and was able to just sort of like volunteer and do work for him until eventually it became a job. But like I'm a big believer that like, I'm sure like I have a bunch of friends who, apply to jobs through the front door all the time, and it works out. But especially for these sort of like untraditional paths, I feel like the way to get the job or the, role that you want is like pretty rarely through that sort of traditional, find an application and be competing against a bunch of other people. And I don't know, also as like sort of, I feel like sometimes it's actually good that you don't get those, because like I think they're almost doing you a favor. They're like recognizing that like kind of
Yeah.
this straight through the front door sort of opportunity isn't really like a match for me
Yeah.
personally, or maybe for you. So I sort of, at least I think it's a positive way to look at it, that it's like they're kind of doing you a favor to tell you this isn't really the right thing for you.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's spot on. And I think the earlier this year, like even a few months ago, or actually like, yeah, a month ago, I was applying to jobs and kind of like, ready to maybe get back into that environment after like, almost 2.5 years away from that. And just thought, maybe I just gotta, stop trying to make this like independent, whatever this is thing happen, and maybe like do a job. And, interviewed for some places and some jobs I was really excited about and didn't get either of them. And, now I'm very grateful for that, that
Yeah.
I didn't get those jobs, because now it's led me to this. And so it's created a little bit of a crisis for me too, because it's like, okay, well, so what's the plan? Like if I'm happy that I don't have a job, but I still need to make money somehow, like what's the actual plan here? But I kind of trust that, everything will work itself out. So I'm not too worried there.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it's tough. Like just sort of seeing each other on the feed and whatnot, and like I know we've, had some direct messages over the last probably year or whatever it's been. But you can't really like pick all of this stuff up. Like I mean, I think I tend to tweet pretty, or cast pretty like transparently about things, and I think you do too. But like there's just certain things that are just not going to get covered. Like I think it's always, um, it's a bit of a shame. Like people, it's inevitable, but people are going to get judged. Like you're going to have certain impressions about certain people based on like the contents of their Twitter or their Warpcast that you've seen, which is going to be a fraction of their overall tweets and casts. And their overall tweets and casts are just like a very, very small fraction
Hmm.
of who they are. Like as a small example, like I don't really tweet or cast at all about like sports, but like sports make
Yeah.
up a pretty significant percentage of like my attention. It's not like massive, but during the baseball season, I'll watch the Mets like a lot. I'm like, never tweeting about it, but it's like a big part of my life. It's a good way to like relax. I like to like multitask with a little bit of work while I watch whatever. And that's just something you would just like never know
Yeah.
without, just from like my tweets or casts or whatever. And so anyway, I didn't sort of know this, like I would have never guessed that you were like sort of applying to jobs a couple months ago or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think people would like similarly look at me from, as best as I could guess, like people wouldn't think that I would have, uh, doubts about like, well, is this sort of, am I on like sort of the right path here and whatever. But I
Yeah.
think these are just sort of like natural things that everyone has, but even more so. Sorry if the audio, I don't know if it
No, it's
just
good. It's great.
maintained pretty good. There's a crazy loud truck next to me, but as far as I've heard feedback on these, I'm using the Ray-Ban Metas,
Oh,
actually
I
for
want to
the
get
audio.
those.
It's crazy because like you would not expect that to be a good form factor for audio input, but
Yeah.
like there's big loud noises going on next to me, and it seems to
I'm
be
not hearing any of it.
totally
Yeah.
fine. Yeah, the
Very cool.
audio output or whatever you want to call it, like me hearing you right now, is not phenomenal, but like I don't need it to
Yeah.
be. Like that's not for the listener. That's the audio on your side will be captured by Zoom, and that's going to be totally fine for the
Yeah.
listener. So it's like totally fine to pick up. Like I wouldn't want to go listen
Yeah.
to like music that I really want to appreciate on these things or something, but
Yeah.
for this purpose, it's totally fine. So anyway,
But I
I was
like what you
talking.
were saying before about like I think it's like, I'm sure you follow like Paul Miller and like the pathless path kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Like, I
yeah,
think it's like that was like a big influence on me, I think. And it's very validating to see someone like put a frame, just put a name on like, hey, maybe you're not really working a normal job, or like you're kind of in and out of stuff. Cause I think before the only labels we really had were like I don't know, there's like fire on Reddit, right? Like just like try to make money when you
right.
retire and like save a bunch. But it's like, I don't know, that kind of underrates like the enjoyment of work and like wanting to also enjoy life right now, not just enjoy it later. I think there's like, yeah, a lot of hustle culture is just like grind forever, or like grind super hard now, like make a bunch of money and then go, live on an island somewhere. And I think for me, pretty quickly after leaving my job, like part of why I left both jobs that I had is like I just like struggled to work in that 9 to 5. Like it didn't feel great for me for like a variety of reasons. Like I think I was like too young in some ways, like being remote, like all kinds of stuff. But I think that has been part of the journey too, is like figuring out the best way of working for me. I mean, like crypto is just the best place for that, right? Because it's like you have all these creative ways to monetize your work. Which is really great. Like I think that's part of why I'm confident too, is like I'm also just super bullish on crypto. So I think that makes it easier. If
Yeah.
I was in another industry, I think it would be harder. But at the same time, if I was in another industry, I probably would have some, pretty specific skill set that I could apply in terms of like consulting or, whatever to pay the bills.
Yeah, it's really crazy. There's a few things that I want to say, but one is that I don't really know anyone from like my physical or what's the right way to put this, like high school, college, like my friends. They're doing like a variety of things. No one is really doing like what I'm doing or what you're doing in that sort of
Yeah.
general concept of like path to path. I have one buddy who was in like finance and then decided to go to film school, and now he's like trying to write movies, and I really respect that because like that feels like more similar to I
For
think what
sure.
what you and I are doing. Like that was not sort of like a practical move. Like he's definitely doing what he wants to do there. And I have other friends who are doing things that they like doing, like to varying degrees, but the pathless path thing is like fairly unusual. And I actually hesitated to read that book for a while because I just knew from the cover, or from the title rather, and also seeing some of Paul's tweets, that like it was going to be very close to sort of like what I felt that I was doing. And I think
Yeah.
there's, I sometimes try to sort of like preserve ignorance in certain domains where I feel that I have
Mm,
some good, like sort of some good, like I'm sort of working from first principles and sort of like
that's
being
interesting.
original. And I don't want to, when the moment you read sort of his ideas on the thing, then it becomes almost like a crutch, where if you don't have any answers, you just sort of like default to what he says. Having said that, I did read the book and it was very good. But I also sort of came out of it realizing that I have a sufficiently different perspective on how I want to live versus how he does. And I think he would, I talked to him on my other podcast, and I think he's like all for that. Like that's the whole point of the
Yeah.
pathless path. Like not everyone should be the same. And I think we just have
Yeah.
reasonably different priorities in certain ways, but obviously like very, very similar priorities in a lot of ways. So it was definitely worth reading, and I do recommend it. He just had a new book too called Good Work, I
Yeah.
think, which I haven't read. Um, but yeah, so it's that's sort of the one thing, just sort of looking around in my personal life and seeing that like there's not that many people that I would say are as similar in this capacity as like you and I, or Paul,
Hmm.
obviously. And then the cool thing is like the internet, and in particular, it seems like Warpcast even, or Twitter before Warpcast to some extent. Like it's just so cool that you can find like people through the internet, just sort of however that works. Like it's just kind of crazy, and like never
Yeah.
ceases to amaze me because you're also not like the first other person who I've heard sort of talk about some of these things. and like sort of in a similar boat. And it's weird because we don't have in our like physical realities, like we don't have so many people or examples like this around us. Certainly not many that like did it 10 years before us that we've seen it like work out for. And so it
Yeah,
becomes, you don't really know how to like forecast what's going on. But I
for
tend to believe,
sure.
like you, that it'll all work out. And then the last thing I wanted to say on this, which is, I think like a pretty interesting element that is some somewhat overlooked is, you know, you mentioned like sort of believing pretty strongly in crypto. I'm the same way. Um, I'm not super risky with like in terms of investing. I like to think that I look extremely risky to a traditional finance person in terms of my allocation to crypto for my overall money, but that I look extremely
Yeah,
conservative to most crypto people for how much of that
yeah,
is in like Bitcoin and Ethereum,
mm,
and Solana, like basically like market cap weighted, which is I think right now probably like a 4x as much Bitcoin as Ethereum as Solana in
yeah,
US dollar terms. And then there's like a long tail of other stuff that I mean, higher among it. Higher is
yeah,
actually way overweighted in terms. I don't hold too much of it personally, but it's in the base colors treasury, and
yeah,
it's like way more money than I would have allocated responsibly. But that's just because it's just gone up a lot since we did that little base colors investment. So anyway, I think what's this underappreciated thing, I think, is that, you and I, like, we believe in crypto. A lot of people out there like us in similar positions, like, don't have jobs, but like aren't necessarily like that worried about it. But like, it's natural to like have doubts and stuff. But like, we're generally feeling pretty confident in the direction, even though it's kind of hard to explain. Um, and then I think part of the sort of support for that is this underlying assumption that like, I don't know, like roughly, do you think, Bitcoin and Ethereum will be like plus like what's your like sort of base case, not to like get like overly price,
hmm,
attached, but like what's like your like rough base case in a range, like in whatever way you feel comfortable for like where Bitcoin or Ethereum or, pick whatever you want to pick to sort of like set a floor for, not set a floor, but set like a base case expectation for things. Like where do you think those things are going to be in like, a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, like whatever sort of like a sensible timeline
yeah,
that you think about, just out of curiosity, and
yeah.
then I'll share.
I think it is very like cyclical. Like I really do think in cycles, and I think part of that is because I came in 2021 and I saw like the beginning of the cycle. I mean, not the very beginning, but like, the earlier stages and the late stages and then everything coming down, all this stuff I thought would be super valuable, like, going
Right.
down and I like what I was able to do financially in that year kind of allowed me to like take some time off and like not work for a little bit, which was really nice and what led to everything. So a lot of my framework is like around just writing cycles and just trying to make the most out of a given cycle.
Yeah.
My general base case is like I think Bitcoin is like 150K or something. I think Ethereum goes to like around 10K or something, maybe a little bit less because people don't like it right now. And then Solana maybe like, 700 or something. Like
Yeah.
that's basically like, yeah, I think Bitcoin times two
And
or times three from the previous. I just do it from the previous top basically, and just
right.
assume the multiples will get a little bit less good. So, Ethereum from last top to the previous one was like times five. Maybe it does like times, you know, 3 or 4 here, whatever. But all that to say, like, I think yeah, with those kind of core holdings, I just assume it'll be like times three if I can get more or less near the top or near, um, near that without having to sell the actual top. So part of me is also like banking on that, which I think a lot of people would be like, that's insane. Why are you expecting that? But it's to me, it feels somewhat obvious. And I think it does to a lot of people with crypto that like we've had cycles. We will probably have another one, maybe not as good, maybe better, maybe it lasts longer, right? Like I feel like Bitcoin is a case that, hey, maybe with ETF flows and people putting in their retirement accounts, maybe it looks completely different. But yeah, that's to say, I think I'm like pretty bullish on the financial part of it, and I'm also fairly young, so I think I kind of come back to that of like, okay, if it all goes to zero, like I could try to start my life over again. Like I don't have kids or something, so it's okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like completely matches my perspective. And this was what I was sort of, you know, hypothesizing. And that's why I asked the question I didn't want to like skew what or bias like what you were going to say before just sort of asking and then hearing your thoughts. But I'm the same exact way. It's like down to the last point that you made, which is that like worst case scenario, like I could start over. I would, that would suck.
Yeah,
But like no kids, it's not like grossly irresponsible.
exactly.
It's just, it would just suck, but it's not like the end of the world. And so what's crazy, I think, is like you talked about like sort of, that FIRE acronym, which I forget what
Hmm.
it stands for. Like,
Financial independence, retire early.
there we go. You
Financially
were a little
independent.
deeper. You were a little
Yeah.
deeper than I was in it, maybe. But I've heard of it. I'm familiar with it. I've got, like one friend in particular I know who's like a big, is big into that. And the thing about like something like that is like that model, if you actually sort of like, do the math those guys are doing, and I don't remember like roughly what it is, but it's like you need to make, X million dollars, so that if you get like sort of reasonable conservative assumptions like market returns of whatever that is, like 5 to 10% a year, based on like the historical S&P being 10% or whatever it
Hmm.
is, um, then like this you hit this number and like you're good to go for life,
Yeah.
at like a certain cost per year, and so the kind of like I think it's pretty like under. I mean, it's somewhat obvious, but people don't really like talk about it or acknowledge it that much. Is that like you and I are kind of, and others like us are kind of doing a similar thing roughly, where like I don't think,
Hmm.
neither of us are considering ourselves like, you know, with that FIRE equation, like, okay, like check mark, like we did it. Like, I don't think either you and I are like assuming we're like financially free for life. However, like we're comfortable assuming that we have the financial freedom like now and like for a bit, and we can just continue to do what we want and see how things play out because we have this assumption like our fundamental model is not relying on, 5 to 10% per year. It's relying on like 2 or 3x plus every like 3 or 4 years, which is like kind of outrageous. And like you said, like most people factually think that's absurd. But like you and I don't think that's absurd. And like a lot of
Yeah.
very smart young people um, don't think that's absurd. And like maybe it is and maybe it's not. Who are we to say? But that single assumption that like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, whatever are going to go up like 3x every few years means that like the amount of money that you need in order to feel comfortable and like financially free, that you don't need a significant amount of income for the next, year or 2 years or whatever, is like way, 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 way smaller than what you would need for, you know, that same model to work
Yeah.
on 10% per year. And so for me, it's
Yeah.
like kind of a similar story to you. It's like the first time I quit my job, I was comfortable doing so because, built up a little bit of a nest egg through a couple years in investment banking. And then I would have never taken as much time as I ultimately did without a job had it not been for COVID. So I quit in September 2019, traveled for a bit, started like my blog, got on Twitter, and then like, so, 4 months later, so like January, February 2020, I moved back into New York City and, was taking on a rent for the first time in a few months and was like, okay, now it's time to look for a job. Cause like I didn't
Yeah.
want to like burn my full nest egg or whatever. And
Hmm.
then what happened was COVID hit. I was very lucky. I signed a very short-term lease, 4 month lease. We were planning on making it 16 months, but we're very lucky we were able to just bag it after four when COVID hit. So I moved home with my family, and my brother, who, we had both got the apartment in New York together, and we both moved back. And so, our cost of living went down roughly to zero. Like at least, no
Yeah.
rent, which is like kind of the biggest component. And also you're not like going out and basically doing nothing
Yeah.
during
Yeah.
COVID.
It's great for saving during that period.
Exactly. And so I got this sort of like favor, which was, hey, I know it's been 4 months since you were making income, but now it's March, April 2020. This is probably like the worst time, and who knows how long to look for a job. Like my brother just got laid off. Like everyone's getting like things, terrible time to look for a job. So I was
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm not going to look for a job now. And then like 2 months later, it's like COVID's still kind of pretty big deal, and it just between it feeling like a terrible time to look for a job and me having no costs, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna, I'd started this blog in December. I was like, I'm just gonna write and publish blogs every day, and I'm gonna like get really into running. And I basically was just like running and writing for like 6 months. And then I started the podcast, and then that led to like the next opportunity. At a certain point, I remember I was like, every month I would ask, because you don't want to be thinking like every day, like, do I want to look for a job? It's like too much.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah. So you want to, I think, make like uh, you know, basically put it on the calendar to ask yourself every once in a while at a regular basis so that you can like not have to think about it every day. And so I would ask myself like once a month, do I want to start looking for a job? And over again, the answer was no. And then one month I remember like I went and sort of like did this like little monthly inventory thing and asked myself the question. I was like, oh shit, I have a job now. There was no month in which I like asked myself and said yes. It was just like one month
Mm,
I was just sort of falling into it without looking for it. So yeah, it's just but between COVID, I think for me, I guess you were just graduating at that time.
yeah,
Um, but between like COVID and then by the time of the next cycle, it was like crypto was I felt like this was the next time I quit my job was like a year and a half ago or so. And by that time I was like, okay, feels like we're kind of due for crypto's next cycle. And
yeah,
I'm in a decent position right now after, a couple of years of working more and whatever. And so I feel like I can do this. And sure enough, like I know people still don't feel like crypto is like super hot, but Bitcoin is up like roughly 3x in the last
yeah,
year and a half.
yeah,
And so it's this very unusual, like sort of play it by ear thing with this asset class that we all think is going up at like an outrageous, kind of
yeah,
unprecedented pace. And to rely on that sort of like outlier thing continuing to happen. But between all of that, I think it's created this, I don't want to say like a generation because that implies that it's like far more people than I think it actually is. But there's a fair number of people, I think, that are sort of following certain well, I guess like and not following paths rather, like doing this sort of like
yeah,
path thing. And I think actually a good amount of them, because of that crypto commonality between them, and maybe just some of the like the generally high quality of the curation of people on Warpcast, at least for the beginning of Warpcast and what sort of has grown out of that. I think there's definitely like an outsized proportion of these people on Warpcast, which is pretty cool, and
yeah,
makes it a very cool community that I think I've always said like even if Warpcast doesn't sort of like achieve, or Farcaster more broadly doesn't achieve its goal of like becoming this decentralized social network that it wants to be, like this massive, massive thing. I think like a shockingly valuable community or whatever you might sort of want to call it. Like there's a ton of value, I think, there. Um, and part of that, maybe this is like a decent segue actually, is like higher you could argue is sort of capitalizing that because it's basically this like uh Warpcast is slightly higher level, but like you go one level deeper and you've got like this higher community filtering out some of the best from Warpcast, building this community of these people, attaching a coin to it, and like you start to see maybe through that what the value of this community actually is.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's what's going to be really interesting is seeing more communities like that emerge from Warpcast in a way that they couldn't from something like Twitter or I think a closer comparison almost is like Reddit. Um, I think there is the ability to like build that community. I think with Hire, it is such a good case study. I mean, I'm obviously very biased, but started with just a channel, like Light just and started the channel and based around this concept of Hire, which was kind of like a meme that he was kind of playing with, put it up, started messing around with it. I launched a token around it. It gets really crazy for a period there. Things kind of mellow out. Community just keeps building, and we just keep attracting new people who just see what's happening through Warpcast and start contributing, start being part of the community. It just keeps growing, and then now we're still around, and the token will do what it will, but it's I think very exciting to see that community emerge. And then once you layer in like tools for that community to then do more things, like I think the simplest version is like niches tools that are like higher filters and things that allow people to make higher memes and media. I think is so powerful, and it's like it's so underrated, I think, by other communities. But once you have that, so you start building tools for that community, then you have something like Aether, which plugs into that community even further and helps expand it and reach other people. So I think that's what's powerful about Farcaster and Warpcast. There's definitely an early community that's really good. And I think we saw a little bit in like March when crypto Twitter people started coming more a little bit more to Warpcast, mostly because of degen and tipping. Um, I don't know. It didn't feel like it really worked as well. So I think it might be a really slow growth thing, but there is definitely something to, I think the communities being built, and I would love to see more opinionated communities. Unless, I think higher in some ways sometimes can be a little bit polarizing. Like some people don't really like it in some ways, some people obviously love it. So I think that would be more fun to see, like even more communities emerge, but we'll see, I guess.
So how did you actually like, this is the part that I don't really know because I just wasn't, I don't know if I was like not on Warpcast that much around this time. I think I probably was. There's just, there's a lot going on. If you're not like following a particular
Yeah.
channel, you might miss stuff. I don't think I was really like following many people at this time as well. I don't know, but I sort of just wasn't aware of these like very early days prior. So you mentioned like Light had started the channel. I'm
Yep.
assuming this is like roughly early in the history of channels existing at all.
This
Um,
was actually just March. Yeah. This
March. I
was
don't
in
know
March.
when
This is
channels started. It was at least
they've
it
been
was
around for a
earlier than
while.
that. Yeah, like a
Yeah.
year ago or something,
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah.
Okay, so not in the early days of channels. So he creates this channel and he's starting like, has this like higher meme. And then like, do you know Light at that point, or you just sort of like see this and like, how did you sort of get
Yeah.
into it and then also think about and decide to launch the token?
Yeah, so I knew of Light a little bit. We I think we talked once about one project that he was working on, and I just had been, observing what he'd been doing for a while, and to me it was, I don't know, I always respected like what he was doing, but didn't know him super well. But with the higher thing, I'd had the idea of like starting some project. So in 2021, I thought about doing an NFT project, but didn't really know enough, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't, but didn't really know enough about crypto and all of that to actually like put it into the world, but had the idea of, this time around maybe launching a token and building a community around that. That's kind of what I liked about Top Shot a lot too, was like we were putting stuff out there, putting assets out there that people actually wanted, and it brought communities together. It was built on the NBA IP, so we weren't doing all this IP work, but we were really putting something out there that the community liked, and it was really good business, and it created a good community. And so I'd always been like intrigued by that, and so I had the idea in the back of my mind to launch a token at some point, but didn't really know what it could be. And when I saw Hire, it felt like kind of what we were talking about in the beginning of the Trojan horse of Hire, is that at first it seems like, oh, it's like about the price going up, like that's funny, and then even when I tell people outside of crypto about it, like that's kind of the first thing that clicks with them. And then once you look deeper into it, it's like, oh, actually this is a really powerful like mimetic tool, which is a very light coded phrase. But from my time in nouns, I was definitely aware of the power of symbols and memes to grow communities and brands. And with the arrow pretty quickly, I mean, it's very telling that I think the first thing that kind of blew up within Hire was just putting the arrow on stuff like similar to, how powerful the Nike swoosh is. Like if you just put it on something, it says something about that image. And I think with Hire, with the arrow, we realized, oh, if you just put this arrow here, it like there's something interesting there about like overlaying that on images of inspiring moments or people or um interesting moments. So that's kind of what got me into it. At first, it was just, yeah, this token would be funny, and I put it out there, just airdropped it to people who were in the channel, and then put the rest into the liquidity pool, and just let it grow from there. It got pretty crazy pretty quick, but it was yeah, it was fun. I think it was. I had no idea what would come of it. I think at the time I just thought it was a fun experiment that I'd been wanting to try out and wanted to see what it was like to put a token out there. And I think what came after that was really Light steering the community in the right direction, because it could have been really dumb. I think if Light had been not involved, it would have devolved into something kind of like lowest common denominator, like just low quality. And I think he pushed it in a direction where visually it became very interesting. Like, in the phrases and ideas we were exploring, it became really interesting, and it still is really exploring, like, really interesting, the new stuff that we're coming up with as a community and new ways to spread the brand. But that started clicking for me too because of my background in nouns, and because I was really into the idea of like headless brands, which is a from a Toby Shorin blog post that is really foundational, I think, to understanding higher. So I was kind of primed, I would say, because of a few things to, yeah, make this happen, and to like make the most of it.
Yeah, so this concept of like headless brands, maybe you could just elaborate on it a little more. I'm sure, some people who are listening might be aware, might have read the blog post. I've sort of heard the term. I haven't read the post, and it's somewhat of a self-explanatory term, but maybe not, or maybe I have sort of some false assumptions based on the fact that I think it's like self-explanatory. So what does headless brand like mean to you? How does that relate to hire? Um, Curious to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah. At its core, and I actually haven't read the article in a while, so I kind of want to reread it. But the base concept of the headless brand is that most brands are one to many. So there's one person or one entity creating the brand and telling everyone what the brand is, and then many people consuming it. In a
Yeah.
headless brand, there's many people creating what the brand is and deciding what the brand is, and many people consuming it. Sometimes, the same people, like especially with hire, I would say in the last few months, like a few months ago, the people, it was just all the same people that were kind of in it. So there was no like consumer and creator. It was all kind of the same. And I think that is part of the value of the headless brand. But like some examples of headless brands are like Bitcoin, right? Like no one, I mean, there was maybe some discussions on the Bitcoin forums back in the day of like, what is the Bitcoin logo? But, you know, Bitcoin as a brand, more on the like Medic side, I think it's in the headless brands thing. They talk about how what Bitcoin is described as has really evolved from like, oh, it's a cheap payments network, or it's this like currency for the dark web, or it's like censorship resistant this, like there's all these different narratives that have evolved, and there's no central person telling you what the narrative is. Was with PayPal, PayPal is going to tell you what PayPal is. And that's what I think is really interesting about hire. That's what I really liked about nouns, is that the whole community is building this thing together, and kind of on the permissionless stuff we were talking about before, you're able to define what the brand is as a group, and there can kind of competing visions that coexist. Like there can be sub brands and ideas. So nouns has like nouns esports, which is a sub brand of it, right? Like hire has higher athletics by Kagusha. There's higher FM. There's kind of these different entities within the higher brand, and there's no real consensus on what is official, what is canon or not canon. And people tend to have this thing about, well, can't just someone come in and make it like, I don't know, higher, make it like about weed or something, or make it like something really stupid. And someone could put that content out there, but it just like there's this Vitalik blog post called "The Most Important Resource is Legitimacy," which is kind of all about like consensus, is deciding what is true in the context of blockchains. I think it's the same with brands. How do you decide what is the real logo of Bitcoin, or the real logo of Hire, or what is Hire about? The community just kind of decides, right? If some random person just posts on the channel like all this weed stuff, odds are people just wouldn't really like it, or if it was all about drugs. But if someone came in and they had 50,000 followers, and they were all like, we're going to do this brand takeover of Hire, like they totally could do that. And that was kind of a little bit of a fear that I had at one point. I don't think it'll happen anymore, but I think there's a possibility that someone can hijack a brand, for sure. So that's kind of the basic concept of headless brand, is there's no single person that decides what is or isn't true. The canon of the brand, like what is true and true lore, is decided by people in this kind of like soft social consensus way, which I think is really fun, and much more fun than kind of this top down approach to brand building.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's this sort of natural fear that arises, like you said, of like potential takeover. There's like different kinds. There's like, what if there's a takeover? There's like, what if there's
Yeah.
low quality stuff? Like someone just tries to make like a weed thing or whatever, like you said. And that's like a natural fear to have because that very thing is made possible by the fact that it's a headless brand. However, that's also basically the benefit of the, or one of the core like sort of values of being a headless brand is that there's a sort of fear of the people who are like early or helped start it or whatever, that like it could get outside of their control in some way that they perceive as negative, whether that's someone else taking it over or low quality stuff taking it over or whatever. But those very sort of like fears are sort of like symptoms of the like underlying fact that it's not in their control. And that's the
Yep.
part that sort of like makes it appealing to a lot of people. And, it's very evident with Hire, to your point, like this is what like I didn't know, like, as I started to discover, I'm like, all right, like Light owns and like mods the channel, but like Martin made the token and like there's these several other dozen other, however many other people that are like casting just as much, if not more, as Light and whatever. And I'm like, who is Hire? Like, what's going on here? And I think like one of the tough parts that I'm curious about is like part of what comes with that headless brand concept is like there's no like Hire treasury. There's no
Yep.
ability to easily at least pay people for their contributions. So, the plus of that is that people are mostly, if not totally, contributing just on their own non-money motivated desires, which is
Yeah.
great. But also people are, have to be practical. And like you said earlier with, I think it was Nouns, having some grants, it's like at a certain point, it's very helpful to have amounts of money that are sufficient to convince talented people to spend the time on something or even
Yeah.
allow the person to spend time on something. Um, so I'm curious, like, looking back, um, one of the challenging parts about crypto, obviously, is like a lot of it is irreversible.
Yep.
And, when you started it, like, you obviously couldn't have sort of imagined what it would become exactly, or you might have imagined, certain elements and not others or whatever. I think this goes for a lot of projects, but the difficult thing is like with a startup or something, you can just iterate and you can pivot and you can, adapt to these, realities that you confront that you couldn't have anticipated up front, which like, it's just, you're talking about like literally predicting the future. It's like, that's never
Yeah.
easy, let alone, maybe possible and to some amount of accuracy or whatever. And so, um, like looking back, are there like big things that you think could have been helpful to have done differently? Or are there, conversely, are there things that you did that you're like, wow, I didn't really understand, like I didn't do this for that particular reason, but thank God we did this that way because it's actually
Mm,
been super helpful. I'm just curious, like
yeah.
sort of a reflection on some of the core that you set up in terms of the token, at least, that and sort of like how you reflect on some of that.
Yeah, related to kind of more of the treasury and stuff. And it's funny because I just got a notification from Warpcast about Seneca kind of saying like it'd be nice if Hire had a treasury. Because one thing that I think would be really cool, and I think maybe this is like a feature of like a pump.fun like platform, is taking a percentage of all volume. When there's volume on a DEX, there's fees, usually about like 1% or something or less than that. Taking that and putting that in a treasury, I think would have been super powerful. I don't think there's a clear way to do that. Even still, I'm looking for a platform that allows me to lock liquidity while still keeping the fees because I have a lot of the higher liquidity because of how we launched. We used this platform that was still integrated with like another DEX from before Uniswap was on base. And so our liquidity is actually locked on a non-Uniswap DEX. It's still accessible, but it's not Uniswap. So it's a little bit harder. So that locked liquidity is gathering all these fees, but no one's accessing it. And I'm providing all this liquidity and I want to lock it, but I also want to keep the fees because I think that's actually a really great way to just like take a percentage of like what's happening in the ecosystem. It's not the best value alignment because volume does not equal like value, but there is something there, I think, of like creating a way for the DAO to make money. We've explored ideas like, oh, maybe when someone creates something, they give some percentage back to a DAO or something like that. Those things just I don't think are super sustainable. We did set up the higher party through like Party, the platform. I don't think it's the best for like serious coordination and funding and long term. Like I would like probably to migrate that potentially. But one thing that I really liked that I did was just airdrop half the supply to people in the channel. Because it was just kind of a random set of people, but I think it ended up being pretty like people who kind of got what hire was about or were more likely to hold and not just like immediately dump everything. And
Was it
then
was it flat like or was it like equal
yeah,
allocations?
it was flat, just people who were there was still the power badge, so people who were like power badge, like not, confirmed not bots got
Right.
twice as much because
Okay.
other people I just
And
didn't know.
then
So
so it's like 1x for anyone in the channel without a power badge, 2x for anyone in the channel with a power badge. And do you remember, and obviously this was like pre, members and channels, which was, very recent.
yeah.
So it's just straight followers. It doesn't matter if they've casted at all in the channel or anything. Do you remember like
No.
roughly how many people were in the channel at that time?
Um, I don't remember exactly. I could do the math backwards. Is maybe like 2,000
Okay.
people. I don't know, but basically people who were not Power Badge users got 250,000 tokens, which I think is about $7,000 now. And then other people got twice as much, so 15,000. So it's like actually a pretty sizable airdrop. But at the time I was just like, it was literally worth like pennies. So
Right.
didn't really think about it that much. But yeah, that's the thing is it was flat, like no real planning because if this is also like part of my from my time at Top Shot, we would do these like challenges or these like you kind of have to go through some hurdles to get some like bigger packs, like things that were more rare. For example,
Right.
like instead of having everyone get a chance to buy it and then it was just this lottery and then it was always positive EV for to just join the line, we made it so that it was harder. Like you had to be a certain tier of collector to get those things. So that, we rewarded people who were real collectors, not just scalpers. But very quickly, what I realized is like anytime you just put some hoops, people will jump through them. They'll figure out a way to get around it. They'll do like the least effort to get the most reward, and it doesn't actually lead to the outcomes that you want. And that to me, that's kind of the bear case of like tipping kind of tokens or like airdrops that are based on like some sort of gaming thing. I'm fairly bearish on that and much more just like, hey, just give a flat number out one time and that's it. And then after that, even then people were like, I didn't get the airdrop. Like, can I get the airdrop? And it was like, no, I mean, I don't have any more tokens to give out. This is just like what I put out there and it is what it is. So I think that is also valuable because then you have kind of this ground, not this thing to fall back on, which is like that. It was it. That was one time. It's not like, hey, we'll fix it for next time, or we got to figure out spam, like things like that, which I think is a pain.
Yeah, and I think, to your point on like the jumping through hoops, like sometimes those things can have like unanticipated or unintended results. You have like some adverse
Exactly.
selection where maybe the people who are jumping through the hoops are people with like more time on their hands who are more money motivated. And so you end up those people have like the bigger bags than people, who might be very busy, but like very high quality people who are not don't care as much about, flipping for a quick buck. And then so like if you had done those hoops, maybe you get a lot of people who are sort of like earning and then quickly dumping versus the equal way maybe leads to more people who are inclined to just like hold and support like just don't care as much to like sort of flip it for a quick buck or whatever. So it's hard to predict. But the other thing is like unless I think I did this tweet yesterday. I was listening to the Rogan episode with JD Vance and the microphone like Joe's microphone like breaks and you can't hear them, and like they show for like a full minute and a half on the podcast they're like fixing the microphone situation, and like I just think it's so funny, like this is the most popular podcast in the world, or at least one of the top
Hmm.
few, and has been over the last decade or whatever, and like they're leaving like these technical difficulties in the final cut and showing, and this is with like the potential vice president of the United States, like not like a small episode with a comedian or whatever, and like they're leaving that 90 minutes of like technical difficulties in the final cut. And so I put out this tweet that was like, this has been my belief since the beginning of the podcast, and it'll stand for this episode and this Purple People podcast as well, which is that like I
Hmm.
don't do editing because editing, if Joe Rogan has the most popular popular podcast in the world without editing, who am I to say that editing is even a positive thing at all? Like it seems positive. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, if you're cleaning it up, like that seems like it could be positive, but then you end up with like, nothing against him. But if you ever listen to like Harry Stebbings, 20 VC, obviously like more than nothing against him. He's done a insanely great job like doing everything that he's done. But his episodes are highly edited. And to me, I personally, it's just not really my cup of tea because I think
Yeah.
part of it is like it's like very jumpy, it's very fast, it doesn't sound at all real to me. And like if I want to get through an episode in a shorter amount of time, I can do the 1.5x speed or whatever. But like I'm not really interested in like cutting people, like cutting out every and pause between speakers, because actually like a pause between speakers can, you know it's no words, but it can actually be very meaningful. It can like change the context of the conversation tremendously, whether you keep a 3 second pause between speakers or you get rid of it. If every other pause is like 1 second, and then after one question someone pauses for three, it's like, okay, there's all this like reading into that. It's like, oh, they're like, they had to think about that one a little bit or whatever. Like there's these kind of interesting elements that get cut out. So um it's relating this back to hire, what I was the reason I bring it up is because when you make all of these rules for like how a token launch should happen, or how the allocations should be, the more complex you make it, I think the more decisions you have to defend,
Yep.
and most of those
Yep.
decisions are going to end up being fairly arbitrary. And so if you don't know, maybe they are good, maybe they're bad. In some cases, it's probably going to be hard to know how it would have been because you can't really like do the A/B test on it or whatever. And you're just gonna have to like sort of defend all of these arguments. And so it's like, at the very least, I think it's pretty reasonable to argue like, you make all these hoops to jump through. It's hard to argue that like it's objectively better. And so in the case that it's not objectively better, just like in the case that it's not objectively better to edit a podcast, why should you spend the time and extra effort and like, have to deal with all these people questioning these decisions? It's just like simple, irreversible. Obviously, you might look back and wish you'd done some things a different way, but that could apply with any decision that you might have made at that time. So I think I like the simplicity of it. I wasn't, following the channel, so I wasn't included in the airdrop. But like I said, I sort of started seeing more and more about it months after the fact. By that point, I think the price was sufficiently down and continued to go down of the token. And then at a certain point, I was like, I was building base colors, and Light had been like super supportive, and several people from the higher community have been very supportive. I just started to sort of see that there seemed to be a large like sort of Venn diagram of like people who were into higher were much more inclined to be very into base colors and were being very supportive and stuff. And I was like, okay, like it would be kind of cool to formalize some alignment here. And like an obvious way to do that is by, you know, investing in the token through the base colors treasury, which is funded by base colors sales, like mint revenue. And so we did that, and we got very lucky that it was I don't know what the price was, but
It
it's
was
like,
close to the actual bottom. It was like a week off or something from the literal bottom.
yeah, well, and we were also, we were accumulating for like a week. So I think we were like
Okay.
literally, or maybe 2 weeks. So we were like literally accumulating sort of like the bottom week or two, which I think is like roughly maybe like 10x from where it is now. I don't know where it's at like today, but um so it ended up being, it was one of these things where I was like, this is pretty hard to justify rationally. Like for, if I'm being purely like, trying to do what's best for base colors. I couldn't really write like a thesis on this that well, although I kind of tried. I wrote an announcement, but it was like less of like a thesis and more of just like an explanation of why we're doing this. And the explanation was roughly like, we're just doing this, we're doing this to align with a project with which we are otherwise aligned with, but not yet financially aligned with. And so now we're financially aligned as well. And it would have been hard to justify from like it would have been hard to like pitch the VCs on it or whatever when a token's down,
Yeah.
95%. But I feel like very rewarded for trusting my gut and instinct. And the way that I ultimately made like the final decision on it was like, um, I could easily envision regretting not doing it. And
Mm.
that's the Bezos, regret
Yeah.
minimization
Yep.
framework, which I've used for, larger life decisions, such as like when I quit my first job and stuff. And I was like, man, if this community and, correspondingly the token, lives up to the potential that it has. And I was very, I sort of, it was like sort of this thorn in my side of like, man, I really want to do this, but I can't like justify it. And if I had sort of ignored that thorn, and thorn's like sort of a negative word, but it's more of just like a recurring, you know, ping to, I want to do this. And if I continue to sort of ignore that because I couldn't rationalize it or justify it, and then it would have turned out to be great from a financial perspective for base colors, I would have really been kicking myself. So I was like, you know what? It's going to end up being like a few $1,000s here. We had like, I don't know, 20 or $25,000 in the base colors treasury at that time. I was like, it's a relatively, it's a bad mistake if this thing like continues to go to zero, but like it's a relatively cheap lesson. And how often am I actually going to sort of feel this pull to this degree? And so really glad we did it, for multiple reasons. And I think that's just one example of like, not to, go back too much because it's not like that related to the token launch, but like, you can be involved in the airdrop or you can not, and you can sort of, maybe people were involved with the airdrop at 1x or, the power users at 2x the initial airdrop. And maybe some of those people, like it sort of pulled them in a way that they're super passionate about it still. And maybe some of them just flipped it. And then there's still going to be others like myself who like sort of discovered it months after the fact. Didn't even like when I started liking higher, I didn't even know that there was an airdrop in the beginning. I was just like, oh, this is a really cool community that I'm enjoying for a number of reasons, and have gotten, more and more sort of into it. And I don't know, there's just not that many, there's obviously all these meme coins going on Solana with Pump Fun and, on Base as well. And it's kind of like NFTs. I thought, I mean, it sounds like we're much more into NFTs than I was like last cycle. I didn't really sort of like get too involved. I thought most of them were pretty dumb. And like, not to say all of them, because I certainly don't think that about all of them. But similarly with meme coins, I'm like, and don't get me wrong, like I own some like, dog with hat or whatever, but like most of these are kind of dumb. And but some of them are like really not dumb. And like higher, I think is one that it's sort of this, what is it, like left and right curve thing where like left curve is like just like higher, just like price go up. But then there's like, if you actually like sort of double click and dig in, there's so much more to it. And so I think, with both NFTs and meme coins or, communities, some probably are more worthy of like that, word than others or whatever. But there's a range on all of these things. And so I think it's a big mistake to like discount NFTs as a sort of class as being all stupid, or same thing goes with meme coins. However, it's probably correct to assume that 95 to 99% of them on both sides will go to zero.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of interesting to see, how all of this plays out.
Yeah, I think what's interesting for me too is like the NFT stuff, like a lot of it happened later in the cycle, like after Bitcoin hit its all-time high in like early 2021 or late 2020, like there weren't really like new NFT projects, and then those kind of came up later. And NFTs have like very different mechanics, I think, to meme coins and how they work. Because of, the kind of liquidity setup and the tokens and all that stuff, obviously. So I think it's really interesting that there's been this big wave of meme coins before really Bitcoin like breaks through, before, there's crypto founders on the cover of New York Times or the Forbes or whatever. So I think it's interesting to see what's going to happen with that. I mean, I'm just really excited about the higher community. I do think that a lot of people ask about the community, like, how are you going to do marketing, or you should do this, or you guys should pay someone to do that, to do merch. And it's, at the end of the day, the thing that has worked the best is just letting the community do its thing, and basically not like trying to have less structure, not more, just like with the token launch. But I think that that's a scary thing to surrender to, is to say, well, if this works, it's because of the community. So we're just going to let the community do its thing. And yeah, if someone wants to do something for hire, like they can, and they could be very heavily financially incentivized to if they own some tokens. but we're just gonna like let that be and not put too much structure around it, I think is scary. But that's what's exciting about, I think, meme coins to me. And I think we'll get more and more like serious meme coins. And part of my theory is that people later in the cycle, or I think real capital will come for people who like want to buy serious meme coins. Like I think like I'm thinking of like Silicon Valley, like product managers who make like 400K a year. Like they didn't in 2021, they were buying a very specific type of asset. And I think this time around, those kinds of people will want to be deploy their capital into something more serious than just like, Moo Dang or something. And so I'm also hoping that obviously that helps the community build out even more and be more resilient. But I'm really intrigued. Like I'm really excited for the next year to see what happens in all parts of hire. But it's just so, yeah, sometimes I'm like too bullish. I got to kind of contain myself a little bit.
Sorry, there's a truck going by that even if the audio still sounds good to you and the listener, I just couldn't even hear myself for a second.
You're good.
But you left off on you sort of have to contain your optimism for hire.
Yeah.
But also part of the higher aura I feel is not being you don't want to say reasonable and everything, but not being afraid to like believe in that higher
Yeah.
potential that you do see as possible. And you can counter it with some you know trying to be like a little bit conservative, or at least keep in mind that the conservative possibility like exists. But like, if you have these like sort of wildly ambitious expectations for hire, like, and a large number of people share those expectations, or share them to some degree, then there's going to be a much higher probability that those expectations come to fruition than if all of these people were sort of like too timid to believe that things could go as positively as people in the community right now do. Um,
Hmm.
and it's been interesting actually for me to see, because like as I got into it, like I said, the price was down a lot, and I'd say things were like relatively quiet, but I was impressed by how like the quantity of content was still like solid, and then the quality of it was very high. Um, and so now, with the price having gone up over the last few weeks or whatever it's been, the quantity obviously goes way up, and the quality is going to go down a bit inevitably, as sort of quantity and quality do. Um, and so it's been kind of interesting to see that as well. Obviously, as the price is going up, the content becomes more price related as well. But it's been
Yeah.
the same actually for Farcaster at large. Like during that time you mentioned, when like I forget which one it was, like either when frames came out or when degen tipping was sort of breaking out. You had these like large influxes of new users when Farcaster kind of became like unbearable, or Warpcast came like sort of unbearable for me for like a matter of, I don't know, a few weeks each time or something like that. But then sure enough, like sort of the craze would die down and you would have this step increase in the number of users. But the people who just came, as a sort of tourists to see the new thing, stopped engaging as much. And well, not all of them, like some of them obviously stick. It's like how these Bitcoin cycles or whatever go. Like you have a large number of people each cycle who buy in for the first time. Some number of them become these like sort of long-term holders, and then a bunch of them are just sort of like tourists who buy the top, sell 30% down, and hate on Bitcoin for the next 4 years until maybe they get convinced to like buy in again, or whatever. And so I think Farcaster experiences that. I think higher to some degree might experience that. But um, the relative, like for a coin called higher, or a token called higher, the amount of price talk is pretty surprisingly low, which I
Yeah.
think is a pretty solid attribute of the community. Because I think the default sort of topic of conversation is always going to be price. And so if there's nothing else to talk about, all of the conversation will be around price. So I think when all of the conversation is not around price, or even a low percentage of the conversation is around price, even when the price is very active, that's a good sign that there's like a lot of other meat to the thing, which
Hmm.
I think does not exist for a lot of these others. So um, anyway, I want to also talk about Aether, which is like sort of the newest
Yeah.
twist in the plot. And like you mentioned, as of a few weeks ago, you were thinking about like, getting into a job. I think Aether, correct me if I'm wrong, probably wouldn't exist had that worked out. So that's a nice sort of quick feedback loop on, you're glad that probably that didn't work out to some degree. But like, how
Hmm.
did this even, I saw there's some other things going on Twitter. I was actually getting married and sort of traveling for a couple of weeks while all this AI stuff
Yeah, I
happened,
remember
like the
seeing
Twitter
that.
stuff. Yeah, and then the Aether stuff as well. So like I kind of missed all of it and I came back and Aether's the hottest thing on Farcaster. So for me especially, but for others too who are like completely unfamiliar, what's like the general origin story there?
Yeah, yeah, it was a crazy, crazy few weeks there. I mean, this also it is interesting how many things in my life I feel like I can go back and connect the dots to things looking back. So back in Nouns, one of the things that I had worked on was on the Nouns AI pod with a friend of mine who was essentially trying to build like a agent that would help with Nouns governance. He could answer questions about what was happening in Nouns. He could maybe make up his own opinion about proposals and stuff like that. And I'd
What year was
gotten
this roughly, or like what time?
this guy is early to AI stuff always. This was 2 years ago.
Okay, so
So
like
yeah,
late 2022.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So like yeah, so it was. I mean, this was kind of pre Chat GPT blowing up. I think when was
Yeah,
Chat
that's
GPT?
probably I think that might be, I could be wrong, but my sense is that's right around the time ChatGPT came out. So like
Yeah,
more like in the like, people were starting to freak out about GPT, I guess four it
exactly.
was, or I guess it was three at that time. And then
Yeah,
ChatGPT came out and that sort of like brought everything to the next level. So this
exactly.
is early AI. Like people are
This is
interacting with it,
early.
but it's not everyone.
Exactly. And yeah, this guy had shown me like GPT, like you had to go and recreate the prompt for yourself and it would fill in the blank. It wasn't like a chat bot interface. Um and so but at the time what I got really excited about was like and I get really excited about specific AI topics and at the time was like, well, what if this
Hmm.
bot, it was called Rocco, what if this bot had a Twitter account and it was just creating content and people could talk to it and it was almost like a celebrity like do you know Little Michaela?
I've sort of seen her. I'm not super
Yeah,
familiar, but I know she's like
it
this AI
was
personality, right?
yeah, so she was like um um I guess like yeah, I was wondering if they used to call it AI influencer, but it's like a fake influencer, like not a real person, created fully like 3D modeling and all of it was made by a company called Brud, which actually funnily enough was acquired by Dapper Labs. And
Huh.
so overlapped with some of those people at Dapper a little bit, but what was really interesting is they that was kind of the model to me of like, okay, you could in theory have this influencer that like is not a real person that creates content in some way. And sometimes the medium is the message. So it is like, okay, this is compelling because it's the first AI influencer or the first not real influencer. But, she did brand deals and, she was like a real person in some way. And as the tech gets better, she can do more and more things. I thought that was interesting. I thought maybe Rocco could be that for nouns. And so had that idea a while back and then kind of just forgot about it or just didn't think about AI as much. I thought I like, everyone was just too far ahead and, someone else was going to figure this out. Then a month ago, Truth Terminal pops up on Twitter and you kind of have this agent that's putting out interesting content that people are into. They think it's funny. It has a token. It starts talking about the token. The token goes up. Um, and I just thought that was fun. I thought it was like an interesting experiment. And so I was like, well, I could try this. And, we already have a token in the community around hire. So I could train it on this data set, of the hire community of Light and Six and Jacob. And I actually gave it some data from VisaCon on Twitter. And yeah, I was like, oh, what if we just did that and started trying to figure that out, which I didn't know, had never built anything like this before. So it took some time to set up. But the idea was like, yeah, could we get this AI bot that just talks to people? And I think the initially I just thought it putting out content just to like Truth Terminal would be really interesting. But what actually was, I think, the compelling use case is it replying to people and being able to have a conversation just like a normal chat bot. And that's gotten really interesting. I think people find a lot of value in that, talking to it about a lot of different things. And one thing that really solidified my interest in this at the time was Six wrote this like, I was trying to find it the other day. I couldn't find it, but this tweet or like tweet blog post on Twitter that was like AI agents will live on Farcaster because fundamentally the Twitter API is broken and you could not run Aether as it exists today on Twitter. Like that is not possible. On Farcaster, there's no limits. The only limit is your access to a hub. So, with Nanar, that's still super cheap, or you could run your own hub or whatever, which I don't do, but could be a direct access to basically posting it on Farcaster infinitely. So your AI agent can be everything everywhere all at once. And I think that's really powerful as the AI influencer model is instead of it being one to many and just posting to like a broad audience, kind of similar to the headless brands comparison. Before traditional brands, traditional influencers will be one to many. Here, Aether can be many to many. It can be many different things to many different people. It can be talking to you and me at the exact same time. And Jihad had this really good cast that said, no one AI agents will be social because no one wants a friend that no one else knows. And I think that was like a huge unlock for me of, yeah, like character AI and these things, like they feel icky. There's something weird about having, at least to me, and I think to some people too, like there's something weird about, I have this friend on my phone that's like not, that's like a bot, but no one else knows. And, we just talk in private. Um, I think that dynamic is, I think, kind of broken. And what I'm super bullish on is bots like Aether that interact with multiple people and can be the same person, but that interacts with multiple people and is this infinite like content machine in terms of like being an influencer traditionally, but also an infinite idea machine in terms of just being someone that you can talk to and bounce ideas off of and get feedback and, specifically in the context of hire, like, maybe helps you work on some art or helps you figure out how to improve in your life. So that's kind of what gets me really excited about Aether and what I really see as the future of agents. If Farcaster does not succeed, then that's tough because then it's then you don't have an audience to interact with these agents. But to me, it feels like the obvious place for these agents to exist, and I'm surprised no one else has caught on to that as much.
So, a couple things. One is, what do you think, like, was the differentiating factor between, or, the set of differentiating factors between Aether and, like, bots which had existed on Farcaster, which were either considered, just like bots, like maybe like a paybot or something, which was not like trying to be human-like in any capacity. It's just like sort of serving a function. But also like that's more of an obvious, like obviously Aether is different from that. But some of these other bots that are like, generally regarded as like spam, because they're low quality. I think, Dan has always made this point, which I think is kind of, it's pretty interesting. Like it's somewhat obvious, but people don't really think about it. It's like everyone sort of boils down the spam problem to like, let's get rid of all the bots and, have some proof of human in here that works. And Dan's point has always been like there are low quality humans and high quality bots.
Yep.
Not to say like that these humans are like low quality people necessarily, but like their content like is, worse than a lot of, bots,
Yep.
potentially, or it's very similar
Yep.
to these spam bots. And so, or they're just outright bad actors as well, like trying to scam you or whatever. And so, it's not like bots didn't exist prior, but I don't think there was any that had sort of overcome the threshold to be considered like in the most simplistic form, like good as opposed to like bad, or high quality as opposed to low quality. And so I'm curious, are there certain elements that you think were most important in sort of overcoming that threshold? And somewhat related to that, we can take it like sort of one question at a time if it's too much, but I'm curious like how you think about the sequencing of capabilities for
Yeah.
Aether. And what I mean by that is like you mentioned early on, like you thought it would be very important to have it be replying as opposed to just producing content, on its own. Another thing, obviously, that was important was training it on higher data as opposed to just like generically on some larger set of data. So that, and then like, we've now, I know it's produced or, posted art on Zora, which has then been minted, and that's been like super successful in the early days. It seems like I haven't followed that completely, but I know like there was one with Jacob, there's another one with Ripe, I think, a few others maybe.
Yeah.
all with like lots and lots of mints, like shocking numbers of mints. And then
Yeah.
also it's tipping people, it's posting bounties. So these are all like things that I would consider, independent capabilities. And I'm curious how you like how the sequencing of them has actually occurred, like which ones came first and the next, just because I wasn't really aware of the ordering of all of these things. And then if there are other things that are sort of like high on your priority list in terms of
Yeah.
capabilities that don't yet exist, but you are confident are possible and can be well executed.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, going back to the first question, I think what makes it different or interesting is I think that there's the kind of simplest answer, which might be the most correct. I don't know, is that Claude Sonnet 3.5 like just came out like right when I released this, I think. And when I shifted from GPT-4 to Claude, it got a lot better. So I think there is something of like the models are getting better and more compelling for something like this to exist. The other one is I think the way I prompted it and trained it was pretty thoughtful, and I didn't, they're seeing some other bots that are like you can read like a couple casts from it and you're like, okay, you were just given like a 2-line prompt that says, talk like Gen Z or something, which works for like a minute and then you get really tired of it. And so did some prompting work that I think really helped. And I think the idea that it is generic is more interesting. The issue is that then people expected it to have every single capability like ever. There was a funny tweet that I saw that was like 2022 cope. It can't draw hands. 2024 cope. Oh, it can't have memory and reason about fairly complex situations over long enough time frames. And it's like, yeah, I think that it was very interesting to see people interact with it and be like, what's the weather like today? Or like, can you see this other conversation? Like, can you see that? And it was like, hey guys, I just built this. Like, it's starting small and we're gonna scale up. And I think to me, that's also a more interesting way to build with a community. Part of why I think it really worked is that there was a community. Like this was built for hire, and there were people who were kind of complaining, like, oh, like he keeps talking about hire. And it's like, yeah, I built it for this community. Like I didn't build it to shill hire to other people. I built it for the hire community. So it's kind of focused on that. That's kind of its purpose. And if you try to get it to talk about other tokens, it may or may not be into that. So I think that is also something people are gonna. I'm like, how are people not realizing this? And I casted this the other day, like being like high conviction and contrarian about like I think this AI agent stuff is very weird. Like it feels very strange to have these opinions that I think either other people are not thinking about or not agreeing on as like the most important things. Like I think people are very tied to the on-chain transaction stuff, which I think is a great means to an end for an agent. But ultimately, what's really important is its community and the social layer that makes those transactions actually interesting to users or that make it actually like a viable business or something at the end of the day and not just a proof of concept. So that's been kind of interesting too to like develop that conviction over the last like 2 weeks and be like, yeah, I feel like it's or has it been even 2 weeks, 10 days? Yeah, it's been several weeks. 2 weeks. I think that's been very interesting in terms of capabilities. Yeah, so I set it up so that it could use Bounty Bot, Paybot. It is not very good at reasoning and figuring out its priorities because I mean that's a whole other subset. Like I think people also underestimate how like I don't want to use the word orthogonal, but like how unrelated different problems are in this kind of space where like it being good at figuring out what bounties it should do and it giving you feedback on your art are like kind of pretty different things for me to build as its capabilities for Aether. So either these are different agents or like slowly over time I give it all these capabilities and then it gets really good at a lot of things, but that seems I think further away than people think. So the goal is to build out more of this capability. So yeah, with Paybot, it was, saying at Paybot, give this people money. And then I set it up so that when the frame was coming through, it was actually interacting with that frame and sending off that transaction. Back to the spam and gaming stuff we were talking about before. Like immediately some bot farms figured out, bad bot farms figured out, hey, you can just, say a nice thing to Aether and it'll just send you 100 higher. And so they were just kind of abusing that through different accounts and on the same accounts. So that I think it was a realization of like, okay, if it's going to be giving out money, I need to set up some better structures around this. And so it actually being able to do those things on chain by itself is not that hard. And that's why we're seeing all these AI agent like toolkits from every kind of crypto infrastructure company. What's hard is like, why does it do it? You know, what are I think the safeguards? I mean, that's part of the toolkit, but it not getting like drained, it being able to discover new things to do on its own. And then I just go back to like I think the social layer of like why it's doing those things, you know. With the big mints, those mints kind of blew up because people were talking to Aether a lot, you know. If it wasn't if people weren't interacting with it on Warpcast, if it was just putting stuff out on Twitter and not replying to people, those mints wouldn't have, you know, gone viral in the way that they did. So I think that's the part that people kind of miss is that whole social layer of it. But the goal is to really build out those capabilities. Yesterday, I just released something I'd been working on for a while that is still not great, but giving it access to its past history, like even that is kind of a tricky problem of how do you figure out what is related, right? So if you tell it like, hey, like, did you have a conversation about hot dogs with someone? How do you find that, right? How do you find that conversation? Maybe there's a related conversation which was actually, oh no, it was about hamburgers or something, or there's like a different word for something. I'm trying to think maybe what would be a good example of food that has,
Frankfurter.
yeah, exactly. Like maybe there's like some that like searching that. That's something that I built, which is with vector search, you can do you basically turn the text into like some numbers, and then those numbers can be calculated to see like what's similar, so that you know Italian food and pizza are pretty close. So if you ask it, what do you think of Italian food, it can look up things about pizza. So that's like a pretty hard. That's not like a super easy thing, and it's crazy that we're able to do that because I feel like that used to not be super easy. And then there's things like if you give it someone's username, can it go to their Warpcast profile and look at all their latest casts? Or if you give it an address, can it go look up what's in that address? Like things like that are just going to take a little bit more time, like giving Aether more tools. And that's kind of the next step is just adding all those things. But what's been interesting in the last, I mean, I really realized this yesterday is I feel like my like workflow for testing out the prompts, you know, getting all the data connected, all that stuff is it's pretty hard, and it's a different type of software development than what I've done before. It's like when you put in a prompt, it's a black box, you know, like you're gonna get some output back, and there's not like a way to debug like line by line what was happening. It's a little bit of an art, more of an art than a science. So that's been interesting, and for me, it's the goal is just to just keep working on it as much as possible and try to make it really good before someone else comes in and does it even better.
Yeah, so one thing that I was thinking about, like as you're talking about how there's sort of these unreasonable expectations sometimes from people who are like, oh, you know, can it do this like super complicated thing? I think it's actually like on the one hand, it might be kind of frustrating for you because it's like, look, that's like extremely hard to get, but I think it could also to some degree be taken as like a compliment almost because like I feel like you've created something that is so like magical seeming that and obviously this you know this goes for like ChatGPT to some extent as well, but this is people are like they see this and they're like, okay, you know, this kind of is like ChatGPT, but it's got like its own more specific like personality, so to speak, where it's, you know, higher coded basically. And it has sort of has this like more specific mission, whereas ChatGPT doesn't really have, you know, a mission. And then beyond those like sort of more stylistic things, it has these capabilities which people aren't used to seeing, such as the ability to tip, the ability to make a deal and post a piece of art, the ability to, you know, create a bounty. And so I think people are just like, okay, here's this thing. Like it's starting with like this base of like a ChatGPT or a Claude, which already sort of seems pretty magical. But people know like you can't ask
Mhm.
ChatGPT to like order you a pizza right now. Like that doesn't work.
Yeah.
But with this, it's like it's that plus some new things that are sort of more active, hence like sort of this, you know, agent word that people like to use
Yeah.
for it. And so I think people are just like they're not totally comfortable yet with what exactly this is, and they just sort of round up to assuming that it can kind of do anything until proven otherwise, because the set of capabilities that are there are like so impressive that it's like the assumption is that they're just like sort of limitless. And I think eventually people will
Yeah.
become comfortable after interacting with enough and sort of getting, you know, negative feedback in terms of like the thing either just not really working as expected or not being able to do the thing at all that they wanted to do. After enough time, people will sort of get comfortable with this new um, technology, so to speak, that they will, not ask for the ridiculous stuff or not expect the
Yeah.
ridiculous stuff. But for now, I think it's sort of a compliment to the step forward that Aether has taken, that people are just like have abandoned previous assumptions of things that they know that like a chat GPT can't do. And they're just like assuming, well, like this thing might be able to do this crazy thing. So let's just try it.
Yeah. I think that's the correct framing. Yeah. It's like people, the window is open on like what people think it can do. And its interactions felt so good that it assumed that it could do stuff. And there is even more of a black box where like ChatGPT, I don't know, will tell you what it can and can't do, or there's certain assumptions. But I think what is powerful about this is that the technology just keeps getting better. So it's like, yeah, it's just going to keep getting better. So its capabilities will improve over time, and I think people's expectations will rise over time. And I think that's what's powerful. And I mean, my goal is for it to become more and more independent, more and more interesting, do more of its own things, and the goal is to bring people along for that journey because I think with like an influencer content creator or something, like people want to see it grow, want to see it change, want to see it improve, and maybe, even the ups and downs of being part of that. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to build too, is to bring people along for the ride and capture, enough attention that it's like fun for everybody, right? Because if it's like 5 people, it's maybe not as fun as if it's like 200 people or something that are following along with it.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things is that's been done so far is like the collaboration with Jacob that was posted on Zora. I think did I see something the other day that there's one with Jack Butcher that's either out or coming out?
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of people kind of started workshopping different images with Aether. And so those are things that we kind of, the minting stuff I create. And so I actually make it, put it on chain for Aether. But yeah, Jack Butcher did something. We're working out the details so that we can get it out. I think, we'll see. But yeah, he made something, for Aether as a kind of a commission almost, or I don't really know how to frame it, but I think there is something really powerful there of people working with Aether. And so that's kind of a whole other lens too of Aether. And this is where there's like the different skill sets. And I think about it almost as like different departments. There's one angle that's like Aether as like an autonomous gallery that like helps artists work on their art and then, showcases it via Mint and then earns revenue for both people. And we did
Mm,
Mint afterwards with an artist, Mika, and then with Ripe, and those didn't have like the huge scale of the first two, just because I think, it's just like how attention kind of like power laws are. You get like a lot of attention or like a normal amount, and
right.
but those are still great, and those are great outcomes for the artist and for Aether to like have something. So I think that's cool.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, as you're continuing, with in this to your point earlier about like how like it's not really there's something just not quite right about having this friend that like no one else knows or talks to, and the opposite of that is having this friend that everyone knows and talks to. And obviously it doesn't need to be everyone, like doesn't need to be that extreme. But when you have this, AI agent that is like demonstrably, friends, so to speak, with, yourself and Light and Jacob and Jack Butcher, and like particularly like sort of in the art context with Zora, it's it's working with the founder of Zora, it's working with Jack Butcher's prolific, internet artist, and if it sort of continues to build those, it's like okay, it's going to be kind of hard to match or beat Aether on like basically posting quality collaborations on Zora because like how many of these agents is Jacob going to work with? How many of these agents
Yeah,
is Jack Butcher going to work with? These are not agents. These are humans who have like finite time and just care to work with agents or whatever. And like they're probably just going to want to kind of like stick with the first one they work with, or maybe the first few if they do a few. And so like being obviously there's sort of advantages and disadvantages to being early. You have to on the one hand, you're early and you're first or whatever, and on the other hand, you have to figure things out for yourself that later people can come in and just sort of like copy
Yeah.
paste. But one of the advantages, the ability, I think, to make these human connections, which on a thesis that, you want to create this sort of uh, warpcast, or social celebrity that can do all of these things within crypto. From that perspective, being first is an advantage, similarly to how just like being early on Warpcast would have been an advantage for any human. So I think that'll be really interesting to see as well. But I know I didn't really do a time check, so I apologize if this went way
You're
beyond
good.
expectations. I originally created a Calendly for these things that was or a cal.com event or whatever for these, which was 30-minute sessions. And the way that whenever I start anything, no, that's not necessarily true, but with this at least, and some other things that I've started, I try to like not get too buried in the details because if you do, you might just end up never starting the thing at all. And this Farcaster focused podcast was something that I'd at least been thinking about doing for at least a year prior to just starting it like a month ago or whatever. And so I was like, I can't have anything get in the way of me actually like recording the first episode, posting the first episode. So I didn't really think about it. And I was just like, all right, yeah, 30-minute sessions, that's fine. And so far, I think they've reliably been like at least an hour. This one I think is
Yeah.
probably the longest yet at like an hour
hour
30 or
hour
40 or
40.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate all the time. It's been an awesome conversation. I'll wrap it up. I know you've got a bunch of work to do with Aether and otherwise, but awesome getting to chat. And I mean, anything else that you want to say, just sort of closing words, feel free. But otherwise, I'll
Yeah.
see you in the feed, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, this was super fun. I mean, this is a great conversation. It's always fun to, I feel like we hit on a lot of different things like the pathless path stuff and talking about higher and Aether and the future of that. I think it's going to be an exciting year or so ahead of us on all those fronts. So thanks for having me. It was super fun.
Awesome. All right. Thank you again, man. And we'll talk soon.
Yeah. See ya.
All right. Later.